I would love to share a bit on why we're raising awareness around the language of pride and why is it so important to us. So NYPCC continues to stand for justice when it comes to our communities. As you all may know, we are all living in some pretty harsh and sensitive times, to the extent where even the dynamic of our way of interacting with each other is shifting. We are all working towards a better future. And one way of doing so is by educating ourselves on this important matter, such as gender expression, gender identity, and sexuality. So without further ado, I want to introduce our very own special guest who will bring clarity on this topic, starting with Angelica Terepka. So Angelica, Dr. Terepka is a New York State licensed psychologist at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Columbia University Medical Center in a private practice. She specializes in working with diverse populations, particularly with the LGBTQIA+ and religious populations, and received the New York State Psychological Association Diversity Award for both her clinical and research contributions to the field of therapy. She has published book chapters on clinical interventions with sexual minority youth with diverse cultural and religious identities, and runs therapy groups and trainings on supporting the LGBTQIA community. Next up, we have Dr. Angelica De La Fuente, who is a supervising psychologist for the Bronx Family Justice Center located at Lincoln Hospital, where she works with survivors of intimate partner violence. Dr. De La Fuente completed her APA accredited doctoral internship at Providence St. John's Child and Family Development Center in St. Monica, California, specializing in multicultural community-based mental health treatment. Her areas of interest include adapting evidence-based practices for multicultural population assessment and treatment of anxiety disorders, eating disorders, adolescent mental health, school-based intervention, and consultation, and also trauma-informed treatment. So without further ado, I just want to give the floor and the opportunity to our guest today. Take it away, Angelica.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you, and both Dr. De La Fuente and myself are advocates, and we are passionate about working for or working with this population. So we're really excited to see all of you. All right, all. Welcome to Pronouns, Gender, and Sexuality, the Language of Pride. So on today's agenda, we are going to be talking about why our language matters, why it is important to understand pronouns and sexuality, and speak about it in a sense of confidence. We're going to be talking about the gender spectrum, pronouns themselves, sexuality, which is related to gender identity, but not the same as. We'll have a little true-false section, and we'll leave you off with some tips and recommendations on how to be a better ally. So why the language matters. So we wanted to present you with some statistics that are important. First and foremost, there is information showing that there is an association or a relationship between parental rejection and the increased use of illegal drugs, increased depression, increased suicide attempts, and also increased health risk for LGBT youth. We also know that LGBT youth who feel accepted and supported by their families have higher self-esteem and general health in general. And lastly, trans youth who are supported by their families report 52% decrease in suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts and decrease in suicidal attempts as well. That's a huge decrease, all. We also know that studies indicate that 25 to 50% of homeless youth are LGBTQ identified. And in addition to that, about LGBT youth are 120% more likely to be homeless. And that's often because their families are rejecting or discriminating based on gender and sexual orientation. And most importantly, what we see is that depending on different cultures, including the Latino or the Latinx cultures, there are certain values and beliefs like machismo, marianismo, familismo, and the role of religion and spirituality that really influence how a family accepts the LGBT individual who's coming out. Oftentimes what we find is the parental rejection or how a family accepts an individual has to do with keeping the family together. That seems to be at the core of these values. And so for those of us who are comfortable sharing, when did we start to learn about our own gender and sexuality? When did you know what gender you are? I also want you to think about, how do we know what gender or sexuality other people are? Something that's important to state here is people's identity and awareness of it can actually range throughout your life. So we've got some answers saying 10 years old, 3 or 4 years old. Other people might become more aware later on in life. I like some of these answers. So other people are telling me that they know what or who someone else is when the other person wants to tell them who they are. That's really important. And so the reason why I'm asking you is also because how do we know? We've got some images here. The first one is Billy Porter. Anybody want to take some guesses as to gender identity for Billy Porter or sexual orientation? Non-binary. Okay, so we've got some people. Yes, Billy Porter does not identify with any certain gender, although he often plays up a masculine stereotype by kind of messing with our stereotypes, right? Here he's in a suit and a dress, or a gown, I should say. We have Laverne Cox, who openly identifies as a trans woman. She is a Grammy-winning actress. And again, looking at her, could we tell identity? Some additional celebrities here, we have Frank Ocean, who identifies as male and is bisexual. I think that his coming out was actually very important for many communities and shows some representation. And we also have Jaden Smith, who is non-binary. He's the son of Will Smith. More recently, Janelle Monáe came out as gender non-binary. And then we have Walter Mercado, which maybe some individuals know. He's pretty well known in the Latino community for his clairvoyance skills. And he has also famously been gender non-conforming. Typically his answers to relationship questions are, I like who I like, I am who I am. And the last individual we have featured here is Tan France, who identifies as male and gay. Perfect. So I've got some questions in here I want to address. Number one is, what is non-binary? We're going to get into it. Next slide. So this photo may or may not be familiar to you all. This is called the gender unicorn. This is an image that we use to showcase the different layers that we have associated with gender and sexuality. The first layer is the idea of gender identity. And that, in a binary sense, says female versus male, female or woman, or male or man. Believe it or not, that comes on a spectrum. We call it masculine to feminine, and gender can be anywhere in between. That's what gender non-binary means. It means somewhere in between. I'm not in one of those two boxes. Gender expression is also different than gender identity. Gender expression means, how do you present your gender identity? So, for instance, I identify as female and I dress in typically pretty feminine clothes. There are times though that I might like more masculine shoes instead of, let's say, heels or stereotypically feminine shoes, correct? And gender expression, again, is on a spectrum. All of this, believe it or not, is different than the sex assigned at birth or genitalia. So sex assigned at birth is male, female, or intersex. A person can be genetically assigned male at birth, but identify as female. That would make this individual a trans female. I'm speaking slowly just to make sure, because there's a lot of terms, so to make sure that everybody understands. And then we get even deeper into layers. Those initial pieces are, who am I? What do I identify as, right? That's gender identity. Sexual attraction is, who do I like? So sexual attraction means, am I attracted to a woman, a man, or other genders? If somebody is attracted to the opposite gender that they are, they would be heterosexual. If somebody is attracted to the same gender, they would be homosexual or gay or lesbian. And lastly, if you're attracted to other genders, that might make you pansexual if that's how you choose to identify. So other genders would mean transgender, gender non-binary, any individual who doesn't identify as a male or a female. Other genders might also be intersex individuals. And just to clarify what an individual who identifies as intersex is, it means being born with genitalia that is not totally female or not totally male. Sometimes these individuals are actually born with 2 sets of chromosomes. And the last piece after sexual attraction is the idea of romantic attraction. So a person can be sexually attracted to a person of a different gender or the same gender, and they can also be romantically attracted or emotionally connected to someone else. And that's where we find individuals or terms like males who sleep with males. Those are individuals who are sexually attracted to males, but not necessarily emotionally or romantically attracted to males, or women who sleep with women. Again, the sexual attraction might be there, but the romantic or emotional connection might not be there. And I also want you to take a moment and just reflect on it for yourself. If you think about your own relationships, there's many different layers there, right? So having that basic understanding, let's go to pronouns, who we are. Pronouns mean, who am I? Who are you? Pronouns are things like I, she, her, hers, he, her, hims, or him, excuse me, they, or them. Pronouns are ways that we describe other people or we describe ourselves. And so in order to appropriately use pronouns, first we have to know what our own pronouns are. So oftentimes in my Zoom screen, unfortunately not here, because I'm using one from my job that doesn't allow me to change my name. Usually in my screen name or in my email signature, I'll put she, her, they. Those are my pronouns. If I am wondering what another person, how they identify, I may say, hi, Selena, nice to meet you. What are your pronouns? Right? So we ask for pronouns, we know our own pronouns. More importantly, you want to respect pronouns. If someone says, hey, I actually don't identify as a woman, I don't use she, her pronouns. Instead, I go by they, them. You want to respect those pronouns consistently. And we want to recognize mistakes happen. Sometimes we might forget or we might slip in our language because we're not used to it. And if that happens, all we have to do is simply apologize and use the correct pronouns. We don't have to say make a big deal. Simply apologize and kind of keep it moving, right? I do want to address, some things not to say about pronouns. When you're in groups where these activities are happening, you don't want to say, I don't care what anybody calls me. That ends up showing a blatant disregard for pronouns. And for the individuals that is important to them, it kind of says, that's not important for you either. We don't want to say derogatory things like, I don't care if you call me a unicorn. I don't care if you call me him, her, they. Those kinds of comments, they're not appropriate. Again, if we're using that to describe ourselves, an individual who this is important to might say, well, I'm not a unicorn and I do care about my pronouns. And we definitely don't want to say things like it or drop pronouns or, unfortunately, derogatory comments like a he, she have been used. And you don't want to use language like that because, again, it is derogatory and shows blatant disrespect. If somebody does not identify as he or him or her or hers, they may identify as gender neutral and they might go along with they, them pronouns. I'm going to blow your minds though, guys, because we've got more pronouns for you. It doesn't just exist in that binary spectrum. So I have some pronouns here for you. Some of the common ones, she, her, hers. That typically describes female pronouns. He, him, his typically describes male pronouns. They, them, theirs. That can be gender neutral. So can ze, and z. And the way that these next three, the way that you would read them is z, hear, hears, which if you can hear the language, it's a combination of he and him. Her and him. Z, them, zers, or z, zer, zers. Oftentimes what I find, and by the way, this language is constantly changing. What I find is that it's a play on words we already have. Like zer is a play on the word sir, right? That might combine miss. So these, not all of these are going to be familiar to you. And the main point of it is to know that language is constantly evolving. So let's take a minute to practice a little bit. Again, you will see in the orange, we have traditional masculine pronouns. He laughed. I called him. His eyes gleam. That's his. In the blue, you might have traditional feminine. She laughed. I called her. That's hers. To utilize gender neutral pronouns, and that's where I would want you guys to focus on, they laughed. I called them. That's theirs. Believe it or not, you can utilize they for a singular person. I know in the English language, it's a plural. It's commonly used as plural, but it can be used as singular. And a newer term like Z, you would say Z laughed. I called here. Here's eyes gleam. That's here's. The other piece that I want you to remember is that it is not our job to assign these pronouns to somebody else. If somebody comes in and maybe they are androgynous, right? Not stereotypically appearing or presenting as female or male. That doesn't mean I go and say, oh, you must be a Zer. What? No, it's up to the individual to identify themselves. The same way that if somebody comes and says, hi, my name is Robert, but I go by Bobby. Guess what? We call him Bobby, right? Somebody might come and say, hi, my name is Camille, and I go by he, her, he, him pronouns. Hi, Camille, nice to meet you. That's how we use the identification, you see? And so if we take some time now to think about that other layer, which is sexual orientation, that's who do we like? When we think about sexual orientation, this is where we get into more labels, more terms. This is where you might hear the description LGBTQIA+. So I'm going to make sure to run down through some of these definitions for you. A lesbian is a female who's attracted to other females. or a woman who's attracted to other women. A gay individual is a male who is usually attracted to males. Sometimes gay is like a global term. For instance, when you hear, oh, that's a gay bar, that might be a bar where individuals across the LGBT spectrum might go. Or that's the gay community center, right? In New York City, there's something called the Gay Center, and it's a welcoming place for all teens, youth, anybody across the gender and sexuality spectrum. Bisexual is an individual who is attracted to people of their own gender as well as the opposite gender. Bisexual tends to categorize males and females as well. If it's okay, I'm going to jump to pansexual because bisexual says I like males or I like females. The idea of pansexual is a person who experiences sexual, romantic, physical attraction to anybody across that gender spectrum. Not just people who fit the gender binary or the gender stereotype. Transgender refers to gender, refers to who am I. And transgender is when a person's biological sex, the genitals that they're born with, does not match with the gender that they identify with. So for instance, the celebrity that we showed you, Laverne Cox, she was born with male genitalia, but identifies as a woman. Some derogatory terms that we no longer use are terms like transsexual. That's not more commonly accepted anymore. And so transgender is the most up-to-date term you want to use. Queer is a term that's an umbrella term. It can be used to describe many different gender and sexual identities. And I want to be clear, queer is a term that used to be used as a derogatory term in the past. And oftentimes, people of the LGBT community did not like that term. However, there is this empowerment to reclaim the term queer. And so it's becoming a little bit more utilized within our youth. Then we have intersex. Intersex also refers to gender identity. An individual, as I explained before, who's intersex usually has ambiguous sexual anatomy. What ends up happening is the person might be born with a smaller penis or testes that are underdeveloped, or an underdeveloped clitoris and female vagina. Alternatively, they might have chromosomes that don't fit very typically with the XXXY chromosomes, the biological standards. And just to round us up, we've got an individual who is asexual, which means they don't typically feel any kind of sexual attraction towards others, towards anybody. However, I want to be clear, individuals who are asexual can be romantically interested in others. They can desire an emotional connection with others without desiring the intimacy. And lastly, ally means it's typically a non-queer person. It doesn't have to be, but typically a non-queer person who supports the LGBT community. In fact, for many of you who are here, my hope is that you do want to become better allies to support the LGBT community. And I also just want to be clear, we have 9 terms listed here. There are many more. These 9 are just pretty typical, used in the LGBTQIA plus acronym. So now let's talk a little bit more about orientations. It gets pretty complicated, I warned you. So aromantic or asexual, as we already said, there is no experience of sexual attraction or romantic attraction if somebody is aromantic or asexual. We can put a whole bunch of different prefixes there, like gray romantic. That's somebody who occasionally, pretty rarely, experiences romantic or sexual attraction. This typically falls on the spectrum more towards, I'm not interested in sex or intimacy or romantic connection. You have terms like demisexual. an individual who experiences attraction to someone only after having a strong emotional bond or intellectual bond. Heterosexual and homosexual are terms that you're familiar with, but I want to clarify for you. We can be heteroromantic or heterosexual. So typically those coincide with each other, right? A person who has sexual feelings for another person often has romantic feelings for them as well, but it doesn't always have to happen. And that's where we find, as I mentioned, some of the terms like MSM, males sleeping with males, or WSW, women who sleep with women. That would be an example of somebody who says, hey, I'm heteroromantic. I want to have a long-term partnership and connection with an individual of the opposite gender, but I'm homosexual. I'm interested in somebody of the same sex. So great question. Homosexual used to be considered a derogatory word, and it really depends on the way that it is used. If we are using it with intent to harm or intent to shame, then yeah, it's still considered a derogatory word. The same with all of these words, like queer, or any of these words that used to be harmful. Any of these words can still be harmful. And what's happening within the LGBT community now is people are reclaiming some of these words and trying to destigmatize them and reduce the shame surrounded with a term. Again, we see biromantic or bisexual, an individual that is attracted to both their individuals of their same gender or an opposite gender. Pansexual or panromantic is a pretty new term and pretty widely utilized across the youth these days, at least in my experience, and I work with teens and youth. And what it means is I'm attracted to all genders. I'm attracted to people is often what some of my teens will say without necessarily identifying a certain gender. And the last piece of the idea of polyromantic or polysexual. And what that means is experiences attraction to multiple people. Oftentimes you hear the term polyamorous, which means I want to have a relationship with multiple people at the same time. In those types of relationships that are the opposite of polyamorous is monogamous. In polyamorous relationships, oftentimes when we're working within that kind of relationship dynamic, we just encourage consent, open communication, honesty in order for a relationship like that to be successful, right? So let's play some true or false. Your sexual orientation stays the same forever. If you want to put it in the chat, just a T or an F. Okay, we got some Fs. I'm excited to see this. Yeah, sexual orientation can be fluid. You can find yourself even questioning your sexuality because, like, oh my gosh, this actress just came out and she looks so good, or ooh, this person is so kind and generous and I'm romantically attracted to them, right? So sexual orientation does not have to stay the same forever. For some people, it does. For other people, it can change. It's also why you see sometimes individuals that are coming out later in life. And so it doesn't mean that their first or previous relationship was invalid or a lie. Probably it just means that they're living their authentic life and paying attention to their sexual orientation. So we've got false is the winner here. Yes or no, or true or false. We can be attracted to people romantically, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Yes. Yes, guys, that is true. It's why it takes a lot of different layers to make a relationship successful. It's also why you might have a crush on someone physically, but you never actually want to be in a relationship with them, right? Or vice versa. You might have a very strong connection with somebody, but never actually want to sleep with them or be involved in a sexually intimate way. So we've got yes circled here. It is possible to be attracted to people romantically, spiritually, emotionally, and physically on a multitude of levels. And moving forward, true or false? You can only feel male or female. There is no other gender identity. Right, false. We started off this presentation talking about how gender falls on a spectrum. And so at the two extremes of the spectrum is this idea of masculinity and femininity, and everything else in between, we can feel, we can identify with. So we're getting a lot of questions about the science behind gender identity and potentially sexual identity as well. Does it have to do with testosterone levels? There's not a lot of research out there in order for me to be able to fully answer that question. But generally the thought is no. It's not like lesbians have an increased level of testosterone. Although there are stereotypes like, athletic women might be more likely to be a lesbian, but that's a stereotype, right? Y'all just watched the Olympics. There was plenty of women across the spectrum. But for instance, testosterone is associated with increased muscle mass, which you might find more commonly in athletes, but the two are not correlated. Up next, we just wanted to talk a little bit about the anatomy of an ally. So we gave you the definition of what an ally is. An ally is an individual who supports the LGBT community. And the anatomy of an ally is a mouth to speak up against injustice. We're going to give you some specific tips on how to be able to do this. Potentially a nose, this is a little bit of a joke, a nose to sniff out implicit bias. When you sense that things are not wrong, or somebody is saying, no, it's okay to say gay, but they're using it in a derogatory way, that's implicit bias. Eyes to identify privilege, recognizing our own privilege, perhaps as cisgender individuals. I'm sorry, I didn't define that for you. Cisgender means that my gender identity matches my biological sex. It's in line. So that's what cisgender means. It's another term you might hear. So eyes to identify privilege, and that includes our own privilege, as well as other privilege that may or may not be out there. Ears to make sure to listen and empathize with the people of color experience, or with the LGBTQ experience in particular. A heart to cultivate that empathy, to build that community and to build that support for the LGBT community. And lastly, hands to take action and make change within your own families, within your own settings of work. Part of the reason probably why you're all here is to get an understanding of the language so that you can make effective change in your therapy rooms, in your places of work, and hopefully further beyond the world. So we're going to wrap up with some recommendations for how to be a better ally. First and foremost, an ally means an action verb. It means doing your best to actually act like an ally. Being an ally means you have to take action. It's not enough just to kind of like put it at the bottom of your CV or your resume. Ways that you can take action: intervene. If you hear somebody making derogatory comments, if you hear your own kids saying like, bro, that's so homo. I hear my student kids or my students kind of saying that often. You want to question that. You want to address that. You want to talk about that. Perhaps gently correct the person. And that's a very blatant disrespect of the LGBT community. But other times, you might hear somebody misgendering. So if you know that somebody is identifies as they, them, and a person keeps saying he, his, you might want to say, oh, hey, Aaron, that person, they actually prefer to be called they or z. Another way we can take action as an ally is make space for inclusivity. Introduce yourself with pronouns, with your own pronouns in group settings. Don't make assumptions about other people, or use gender neutral language. I have to tell you, if people see my wedding ring and they kind of assume that I'm married to a male, and they say, oh, what does your husband do? I'm often like, ugh. And then now I have to explain, actually, I'm married to a woman and she's fantastic, right? But what ends up happening is it kind of erases your identity. It says, oh, wait, you're not You're not like everybody else. You're not married to a male because you're very physically, you present as a woman. So you should be married to a male. And those assumptions keep those stereotypes going, right? And they can be harmful. Or for instance, if you're working with kids, you don't want to assume and be like, so if you're working with, let's say, with a young female and say, so do you have a boyfriend yet? What if she's not interested in males, right? Instead, we can use gender neutral language like, are you interested in anyone? Do you have any crushes? And kind of keep it broad. In terms of inclusivity, actually, so you might even see in my own office, I'm turning my screen for you, but representation matters. So I have a little pride flag up. I've got a rainbow city skyline. Those little pieces can also be very important to individuals of the LGBT community because they say, "Ooh, this is a safe space." I associate that with feeling safe and accepted. Another piece is to speak up in your own social circles. If you hear family members, if you hear colleagues using derogatory remarks, start right there. Let's start with having those conversations, those very important conversations right there. Also, as allies, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's how we grow. We have to figure out, hey, what do I not know? And I have to be okay with learning about the community or about whatever it is that you are advocating for, right? And lastly, show up. And what that means is support a friend, support a pride group, attend a parade if you can, donate to charitable causes if you can. Even something as simple as, the Gender and Sexuality Alliance at your school is having a bake sale. Okay, go and have a cupcake or a cookie, or just say hi to say, I see you. I've got another question in the chat saying, it's unclear as to why people don't feel safe. The LGBT community in general might not feel safe because we have a history of being persecuted. We have a history of, many years ago, honestly, not even that many, the Stonewall riots were a riot where a police raided a gay bar, right? That kind of started the Pride movement or the LGBTQ movement. Individuals in my own schools, in my own places of work, we see bullying, we see assault. I'm not sure if many of you have been following the news, but some of the LGBTQIA athletes were physically assaulted, harmed. They couldn't compete because they ended up in the hospital. And so there are very real dangers, persecution out there. Thank you for the words, Eileen. There are very real dangers out there for individuals who identify as LGBTQ+. And more importantly, if you listen to some of the statistics that we talked about, individuals who identify with this community, because there's so much rejection, they often have increased suicide risk, increased risk for homelessness, increased risk for rejection, family rejection, which comes with a whole boatload of other mental health issues, right? So we wanted to conclude by just asking, what can you do to be a better ally? If you want to put up in the chat, what's one thing that you feel safe doing to be a better ally today? And Angela, thank you for sharing in response to that comment before. Individuals who are persecuted or minorities simply don't feel safe in majority structures. So Angela had shared that she identifies as African-American, and that feeling of safety, it's not automatic. That feeling of safety and security is a privilege that some people have, right? And again, when we talked about how to be a better ally, recognize that privilege. So we've got so many commitments actually coming through about what individuals can do. Use more inclusive language, be respectful, don't judge. Don't make assumptions, understand this language of pride as a therapist, 100%. Treat individuals with the same respect that you want to be treated. Confront and understand your own biases. Y'all, you're doing the work. This is what this is about. Have open conversations with family and community. Educate yourself, right? Be open-minded. Yes, know where the gender neutral bathrooms are. Be able to provide that for the communities that you serve. Wonderful. And before we open it up to more questions, we just listed here some resources for you as well as your communities that are free. The Trevor Project, which is right here in the middle, is nationwide, very large resource, does a lot of research, but also provides a lot of support for LGBT individuals. The National Suicide Hotline. There are several resources out there for those who are in need. Thank you all for listening and for being patient with our technological issues. But I really appreciate everybody's presence here. And it does mean a lot because I know that you're going to be going out there and really trying to be a better ally and a better support for the communities you serve.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Dr. Terepka and Dr. De La Fuente. You all did such a wonderful job. It opened my eyes even more. Even I tried diving into it and I want to learn more, and I'm just learning even more. So the importance of just educating oneself on the topic about the community, it's so crucial because you never know who you're offending as you're speaking to them. And again, we're in some sensitive times, and you could just say the wrong thing unintentionally and kind of just destroy someone's mood just by saying something off and not knowing. So I do believe like the paradigm is shifting in a way, as you mentioned earlier. Hey, Dr. Terepka, how would you like to be, identified with? Or, it's just that language, just understanding it and speaking it as well, and learning it. So I want to open up the floor for folks who want to ask questions. Just raise your hand or just please put it in the chat box. I know Dr. Terepka was doing a great job by answering them as she was going, but this is your moment to kind of just speak to gain more awareness on the issue that we're speaking.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great presentation. I appreciate it. I think we all have learned a lot today. And my question is, at what age should we start talking to our children? I know the first question was at what age we learn about ourselves. So at what age should you suggest we start having open conversations to our children in a way that they can also understand and not really push it towards them? Thank you.
It's a great question, Rocio. We have this idea that we need to protect children from the LGBT community or from language. However, think about it like this. We are talking to our kids more and more about race, about other types of differences, and LGBT discussions are part of those differences. And so as early as possible, the same way that you say, oh, at this school, there's more male teachers than female teachers. In this family, you have two moms or you have two dads. Or this family, whoever, Bobby just has one mom and is being raised by one mom, or, Jonathan is being raised by his grandma. In that same way, we introduce this as, hey, this is something that is in the world. These are individuals and who have respect, and they are just as normal. We are just as normal as everyone else. And in fact, what ends up happening is, like, for instance, I'll give you an example from my own life. I had a niece come to my wedding, and my wife and I were getting married, and we were both wearing two dresses. And typically we don't dress in very feminine ways. And so this was surprising to my niece, who said, wait, there can't be two dresses. Where's the suit? Right? And her mom gently explained, actually, people can wear whatever they want. And so children have these questions early on because they are part of our world. So start these conversations early on. There's many resources and books out there that you can present to your kids.
And can I also add, so my son is 2.5, and he knows he has two moms, and we're divorced. So he knows he has two moms in different places, but he also knows that there are people with dads, right? So he watches CoComelon. I don't know if anybody has kids here, they know about CoComelon. And on CoComelon, it's all about the mom and the dad and the brother and the sister and the baby. And so he also, at 2.5, right, he's also able to understand that there's something called the dad, and some people have dads, and he's associated, like if he sees a little kid with a male figure or male presenting or a person who expresses themselves in that way, he considers it a dad. He's still learning. He also knows that he has two moms. He also knows that some people have two dads. and it's just because he's in it. He doesn't understand that there's anything different about it. So I think like Dr. Terepka was saying, I think the earlier that we kind of use some of these terms, the more that they're kind of used in everyday language, the more we're making it seem like it's just like anything else, because this is how, I identify. My sexual orientation is like, I consider myself, I'm a lesbian, right? And I'm also feminine in terms of my expression. My gender identity is female. My sex, my biology, like I was saying in Spanish, is female. That's all aligned. But for not everyone it is. And so I think that if something presents itself in front of a young child, just explaining it to them, right? Giving them that information. I don't think it's pushing it on anyone, but I think that it's just like anything else, right? Like Angela was saying, just educating them in a way that's language appropriate. Like my son doesn't understand what having two moms means in terms of sexual orientation or romantic or sexual attraction. He's 2.5, but he knows that two women can be someone's mom, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to address some of the comments that are coming in. Angela, I know you mentioned sometimes you feel very pressured to keep up with the changes. The language of pride, the language of the LGBT community is constantly changing. And so we do need to keep up with it to better serve our patients. And to address Eileen's consideration of, do you need to have very specific knowledge to work with the LGBT community? It's helpful. And so as allies, we want to be able to go out and educate ourselves. There are millions of resources, free trainings, where you can be exposed to this information to become a better ally and a better clinician. And it's helpful. I often think about this in terms of bilingual language and bilingual services. I do speak 3 languages, but I feel as when I'm speaking in Spanish, it could be a disservice to my patients. However, if I'm the only clinician that's available and my client really needs me to speak Spanish, I'm going to break out of my shell. I'm going to use my Spanish as best as I can. But whenever Dr. De La Fuente is in town, I'm like, girl, you got this, right?
Right. Her Spanish is also really good. But I would say in that same respect, right, for those of you who are in a clinical role, the same as we all have specialties in clinical experiences, right? Like some people specialize maybe more in anxiety and more in depression. And then someone walks in the room or in your office with maybe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. You've never treated it. But again, there's no other options, right? Maybe they're on Medicaid or they have limited resources and this is what they got. So what are you going to do? You're probably going to go consult with someone. You're going to read as much as you can. You're going to try to find them other resources. And if you can't, you're going to do the best you can and ask them for support along the way. And also do your own due diligence and your own research. Like I said, reaching out to colleagues, finding experts, reading books, chapters to educate yourself as you go. So, but these are great questions.
It's about recognizing this is a learning process. Part of being an ally is to continuously listen out for new ways that you can learn. It can be overwhelming, but I promise you, the more that you expose yourself to this information, you will find yourself more and more comfortable. So keep having these conversations in settings that you are comfortable to have these conversations and keep expanding.
And Eileen, thank you so much for acknowledging that you made a mistake, using a pronoun for someone's partner, right? And so I know we address this, we're human, we're going to make mistakes, errors happen. It's more about if we don't remember what their preferred pronoun is, that we ask questions, we make sure that we clarify what they are. And if we do know and we just made a mistake, we apologize and then correct ourselves.
Again, it just boils down to just educating ourselves, knowing the language, being sensitive to the times, being non-judgmental, wanting to learn, not being stuck in our own way that we learned from previous generations, learning how things are evolving nowadays, how people are interacting, how interactions are kind of just shifting. Now people are kind of on social media and that's the way of expressing themselves. So it's a lot and it can be overwhelming, but we have to do the most, as both doctors mentioned, to be an ally, to just educate ourselves as much as we can. And if we don't know, it's okay not to know, but ask so that you can know. Right. So don't be afraid to ask or anything like that, because you if you know better, you can do better, as Maya Angelou said. So
Anthony, Lenny Moyes has a question, if you can unmute them.
Yes, Jonathan will need to locate him.
While we're waiting for that, Angela asked, what's the most general term that you can use? How about asking the individual, what are your pronouns? How do you want to be addressed? And using whatever it is that they say. That's probably the best way to go. Alternatively, if you want to talk about like relationships, you can use partners or gender neutral pieces like that.
Lenny,
Also-
you can speak now.
Yeah,
Okay.
also it's kind of using neutral language. The more you can use neutral language, that will help so much, I guess. I just learned that now.
Mhm.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for the presentation. That was very informative, and I appreciate the information shared. I was just curious, as a human resources personnel, how would you suggest to develop policies of disciplinary action around the idea of the language and identifying and once identifying facts around what's being said, and how do you discipline that? If, as you mentioned, if the person made a mistake or was not knowledge is how I'm knowledge now and this information shared, how as a human resource personnel that I can well, I would like to have a follow-up training, but I want to know how I could be able to discipline based on disciplinary action, but also policies to support that.
So Dr. De La Fuente and I are not human resources specialists, just so we're clear. Unless
I just want to know if that's something that you have come across in regards to that, like, and how would you suggest or recommend to that to be addressed? Because what drew me to this training is I'm finding that a lot of cases that are coming to my office is regard to correcting folks, but also if I'm correcting them, how do I know that, oh, how can I be able to keep something in writing that can help them walk away from knowing that this is something that we are zero tolerance here in the organization.
And do you want me to?
So my big piece is prevention. You don't want to use education or presentations like this as a disciplinary action, because then it's like, oh boy, here we go, somebody messed up again, somebody called this individual the wrong name.
Right.
We don't want that term. So prevention is going to be key, making it a standard that anybody who comes in and gets oriented to the new workplace is taking a bias training, is taking presentations or taking in psychoeducation that teaches them about some of these terms and how to be respectful. So that would be the first.
And just to add to that prevention piece, I think is creating a community environment in the space, right? Having maybe depending on what you can have, right, on walls or where, but like posters up or brochures, right, or information. So, oftentimes even in our clinics, we're trying to make them very inclusive. We're trying to make them welcoming. I know that if you walk into Dr. Terepka's office, she has like a whole slew of like pamphlets and I don't see people in person here anymore. So like, but pamphlets and posters and information guides and things like that so that you can provide people, right? So in addition to just educating them, having this stuff available, having it in the environment, reviewing maybe the policies with them, because all of this, and I'm sure you're going to get into this now, and is falling under discrimination if people are using, these languages, or they're discriminating against people because of their gender identity or gender expression or sexuality or sexual orientation.
Yeah. And in terms of, the disciplinary actions, I can't really give much guidance on that. But I see in the comments saying it's not fair to discipline someone who doesn't understand. I can agree with that. However, that's where the education comes in. That's where you do develop an understanding and continue to work with that person to make sure that they are using gender appropriate markers or appropriate language. It even comes down to things like individuals of an older generation might call me doll or sweetie. And believe it or not, although perhaps some family members might call me that, believe it or not, in a professional setting, it's not appropriate to use terms of endearment like that. Instead, you want to maintain the professional titles. And the reason for that is because individuals who are females or gender minorities, and individuals who are LGBTQ, and also individuals who are racial or ethnic minorities have been discriminated in the workplace, right? Could you imagine going up to your boss and saying, okay, sweetie, I got it? Not appropriate. It starts to get into power differentials that are not healthy for work environments. And so explaining the need for inclusive language, the need for maintaining a level of professionalism in that kind of way can help create a foundation. Hey, this is healthy for all of us. This is not a disciplinary action against you. This is healthy for all of us and to create the culture that we need so everyone feels comfortable.
And now I just want to pass it on for closing remarks by my colleague.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. And I want to thank Dr. Terepka and Dr. De La Fuente for this amazing presentation on raising gender pronoun awareness and teaching us about the language of pride, gender, pronouns, and sexuality. I also want to thank the parents and the professionals and everyone who joined us today for this presentation. If you have not done so already, please provide us with your email in the chat box so we can stay connected, and we will keep you informed of our upcoming events and everything NYPCC is doing for the community. Also, please follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and on YouTube at NYPCC, and give us a review in Google and in Yelp. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again in our future events. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.